at the threshold of hospitality. When you picture a medieval inn, perhaps the mind jumps first to noise, the clatter of mugs, the rough laughter of travelers, the braying of donkeys tied outside. Yet, in truth, the medieval inn was less about spectacle and more about rhythm. The steady beat of footsteps arriving, the measured pouring of ale, the quiet murmur of prayers before sleep. It was not a glamorous place, and it was rarely the center of heroic stories. Instead, it was the backdrop against which countless ordinary lives passed, unnoticed and unrecorded, leaving behind little more than the worn grooves of footsteps on a threshold stone. The story of medieval inns begins with the roads themselves. For without travelers, there would be no need for a house of lodging. Medieval Europe was crisscrossed by routes of trade, pilgrimage, and necessity. Merchants moved with their wares, pilgrims with their devotions, royal messengers with sealed letters, soldiers with boots heavy from marching. All needed food, shelter, and a safe place to rest. The inn was the answer to that need. Neither a palace nor a hovel, but something in between, offering the basics of survival to those who could pay, or sometimes to those who simply pleaded. Step, if you will, into such an inn at dusk. The sky outside is dim, a pale parchment of fading light. A dirt road leads to a low building of timber and plaster, its roof thatched, its walls leaning slightly from age. Smoke curls from a chimney, carrying the scent of wood ash and perhaps something less pleasant, the tang of ale gone sour, the heaviness of unwashed wool cloaks drying near the fire. The door creaks as it opens, and you enter into a room lit by firelight, shadows thick in the corners. Inside, the air is warm but heavy. At the center is a hearth, flames licking upward, smoke rising into a hole in the roof. Around it, benches and rough tables. Travelers sit shoulder to shoulder, their cloaks damp, boots muddy, faces weary from the road. A pot simmers, perhaps a stew of beans, cabbage, and a bit of salted meat. Never enough meat to satisfy, but enough to flavor the broth. Wooden bowls and spoons are passed, some cracked, some greasy from years of use. The innkeeper, often a man of middle years with a gruff manner, moves between guests, ladling stew, pouring ale from a leather jack into mugs. His wife or daughter might tend the hearth, turning loaves, filling jugs, fetching water. Their lives revolve around this endless cycle. Guests arrive, are fed, are lodged, and leave again. The faces change, but the duties do not. The sounds of the inn are muted, not boisterous as in romantic tales. A merchant speaks softly to his companion, calculating sums on a wax tablet. A pilgrim murmurs a prayer, fingering a worn rosary. A soldier dozes against the wall, helmet at his feet, hands slack. The crackle of fire and the occasional bark of a dog outside punctuate the silence. Laughter comes, but it is subdued, more a chuckle than a roar. Sleeping arrangements are simple and rarely private. Upstairs, or sometimes in a loft above the hall, a shared room holds pallets of straw. Guests lie side by side, cloaks pulled tight against the chill, boots tucked under arms for fear of theft. Snoring fills the air, punctuated by coughs and shifting bodies. Fleas are common, lice too, and no one pretends otherwise. A traveler wakes stiff and itchy, but at least alive and sheltered. Payment is expected, though its form varies. Coin is preferred, of course, coppers for stew and ale, silver pennies for a night's lodging. But barter is common. A pilgrim might offer a carved wooden token, a soldier a scrap of cloth, or a favor. The innkeeper takes what he can, for he must feed his family and pay his own dues to the town or lord who licenses his trade. The inn also serves as a gatekeeper of news. Travelers bring stories, rumors, and tidings. A merchant from Flanders speaks of wool prices. A pilgrim recalls miracles seen at shrines. A soldier mutters about battles on distant fields. The innkeeper listens, nods, and later repeats these tales to others, adding or subtracting details as memory dictates. In this way, the inn becomes a node of communication, a place where the world outside touches the small circle of local life. Consider, for a moment, the work of the innkeeper himself. His life is as repetitive as it is demanding. Before dawn, he sweeps the common room, clears ashes from the hearth, and checks on ale casks. He haggles with bakers, butchers, and brewers, trying to stretch thin coin into supplies. He tends stables, mucking out straw, feeding animals. His wife brews ale, a cloudy drink of barley and herbs, while daughters fetch water or serve guests. By nightfall, when others rest, the innkeeper remains awake, watching the door, settling disputes, counting coins. And disputes there are. Inns bring together strangers, and strangers do not always mix well. A merchant may resent a soldier's coarse manners. A pilgrim may object to laughter during prayers. The innkeeper mediates, sometimes with words, sometimes with a firm hand on a shoulder. Too much fighting can damage reputation, and reputation is survival. The inn, then, is not a neutral place. It reflects the town around it. In prosperous cities, inns grow large, with painted signs and multiple hearths. In small villages, they are little more than extended farmhouses, offering one bed for coin. In regions of danger, borderlands, contested roads, the inn is fortified with stout doors and narrow windows. Everywhere, the balance is the same. Offer comfort, but not too much. Take coin, but do not appear greedy. Welcome strangers, but keep them at arm's length. Now imagine the perspective of the traveler, for whom the inn is both relief and compromise. A merchant, after a day on muddy roads, sees its lantern and feels gratitude. A pilgrim, feet blistered, bows before the hearth cross and sighs in relief. Yet each also feels unease. Who else will share the straw bed? Will goods be safe overnight? Will the innkeeper demand more coin than agreed? The inn is a place of shelter, but never perfect security. The church watched inns carefully. Drunkenness was frowned upon, immorality punished, and some inns gained reputations as places of vice. Yet at the same time, the church recognized their necessity, especially for pilgrims. Regulations were passed, sometimes limiting prices, sometimes requiring innkeepers to host travelers fairly. Of course, enforcement was uneven. In practice, much depended on the conscience of the innkeeper and on the power of local guilds or lords. Despite regulation, inns were rarely luxurious. Clean straw, fresh ale, and a locked gate at night counted as blessings. Hot baths were almost unheard of, silence even rarer. Yet in their very simplicity, they served a crucial role. They allowed movement. Without inns, merchants could not travel long distances, pilgrims could not reach shrines, messengers could not carry royal orders. The inn was part of the invisible scaffolding that held medieval life together. Think of the inn as a breathing space in the long journey of history. Between towns, roads stretched lonely and uncertain. Bandits lurked, storms threatened, hunger gnawed. Then, suddenly, a building of light and warmth, however modest, offered pause. The inn was not glamorous, but it was necessary. And in that necessity lies its fascination. As you picture the flickering shadows of the common room, the faces dimly lit, the hush of voices, the scrape of spoons against bowls, you may feel the pull of sleep. For the medieval inn, like this narrative, is less about excitement and more about rest, about the quiet moments that pass almost unnoticed, yet sustain the journey. And yet, behind this calm picture lies a question unresolved. How did these humble establishments survive the endless demands of maintenance, regulation, and the unpredictable flow of guests? How did the burden of hosting strangers shape the towns that depended on them? The burden of hospitality. If the threshold of the medieval inn offered weary travelers relief, it also laid heavy burdens on those who kept the hearth burning. Hospitality was both a calling and a strain. To provide food, drink, and shelter was no small task in a world where resources were scarce, roads uncertain, and tempers fragile. The medieval innkeeper lived not in the glow of romance, but in the shadow of constant labor, regulations, and the shifting tide of human need. A day's labor never done. At dawn, while guests still snored in straw pallets, the innkeeper was already awake. He began with the ashes, sweeping cold embers from the hearth, laying new logs, coaxing sparks into flame. Fire was the inn's heart. Without it, no stew could simmer, no room could warm, no candle could be lit. From fire, the day began. Then came water. Inns consumed more than households. Water for brewing ale, for cooking stew, for cleaning mugs, for washing the worst of the traveler's grime. Daughters and servants trudged to wells or streams, hauling heavy buckets, their arms aching, their shoes damp. If water ran low, tempers flared, and accusations of mismanagement followed swiftly. Next came supplies. Bread had to be bought or baked, ale brewed or fetched, meat secured if coin allowed. A pig slaughtered one week could not last the next. Salted fish or smoked meat stretched rations, but only just. Vegetables, onions, beans, cabbage formed the backbone of most meals, cheap and filling. The innkeeper haggled daily with bakers, brewers, and farmers, trying to keep costs low while ensuring enough for uncertain numbers of guests. By the time guests stirred, rubbing sleep from their eyes and coughing in the chill, the innkeeper and his household had already labored for hours. Hospitality was never passive. It demanded foresight, preparation, and ceaseless repetition. The economics of shelter. Hospitality was also a business, and business required constant calculation. How much to charge for a pallet of straw? How much for a bowl of stew? Prices fluctuated with supply and demand. In times of plenty, a guest might secure lodging for a few coppers. In times of famine or war, the same bed might double in price. Coin was not always forthcoming. Pilgrims, often poor, offered tokens of devotion instead, badges from shrines, carved crosses, or prayers. Some innkeepers turned them away, others accepted, moved by faith or pity. Merchants sometimes bargained with goods, cloth, spices, even information. A soldier might promise service instead of coin, offering his sword in protection. The innkeeper weighed each offer, knowing that generosity could ruin a household as surely as greed could tarnish its reputation. Tolls and taxes further strained the inn's accounts. Local lords demanded dues, guilds required membership, and councils imposed levies on ale or meat. To keep an inn was to balance precariously between service and survival. A misstep could mean debt, confiscation, or worse, the loss of license to operate. The watchful eye of authority. Inns were not private havens. They fell under the watchful eyes of church and state. The church, wary of sin, warned against drunkenness, gambling, and fornication, temptations often linked to inns. Preachers scolded innkeepers from pulpits, accusing them of overcharging or fostering vice. At the same time, church councils recognized inns' necessity, especially along pilgrimage routes. Rules were drafted, prices fixed, fairness demanded. Kings and councils, too, issued regulations. In England, some towns required innkeepers to post official signs, ensuring travelers could identify licensed establishments. In France, guilds of innkeepers set standards for ale measures and bed space. Inspectors occasionally checked mugs for false bottoms, tested ale for dilution, and fined those who cheated. Yet enforcement was sporadic and corruption widespread. For innkeepers, these laws were both burden and shield. They constrained profit, but they also protected against accusations. To display a license was to claim legitimacy, a vital defense against rival taverns or angry customers. Still, many lived in fear of fines, knowing that even a minor infraction could cost dearly. The burden of strangers. Hospitality meant opening doors to strangers, and strangers carried risks. A thief might pose as a pilgrim, stealing goods while others slept. A spy might linger, listening to merchants' whispers. Soldiers could drink too much, quarrel, and spill blood on the floor. Even honest travelers brought lice, fleas, and disease. To host strangers was both virtue and hazard. Some innkeepers grew wary, locking doors at night, refusing those without coin. Others trusted too much, only to regret it. Chronicles tell of inns robbed, innkeepers beaten, or worse. The paradox was sharp. The very lifeblood of the inn, its guests, were also its greatest danger. This constant exposure shaped the innkeeper's character. He learned to read faces quickly, who was weary but honest, who was desperate, who might be dangerous. He became a judge of voices, weighing sincerity against deceit. His hospitality was tempered by caution, his kindness by suspicion. The burden of space. The inn itself bore burdens too. Buildings were rarely spacious. A common room for eating and drinking doubled as a sleeping hall when numbers swelled. Straw pallets were rolled out, sometimes 3 or 4 to a corner, bodies pressed close. Privacy was nearly non-existent. To sleep in an inn was to hear others snore, cough, whisper, and shift beside you. For women, this lack of privacy could be alarming. Innkeepers sometimes provided curtained corners or separate lofts, though not always. The stables, too, were vital. Animals required care, and a merchant's horse was often worth more than the merchant himself. An inn with poor stabling risked losing customers. Thus, innkeepers mucked stalls, spread straw, and secured fodder. A weary horse, poorly treated, could cripple trade and reputation alike. The household strain. Behind the public face of the inn lay the household that kept it running. Wives brewed ale, measured grain, and tended gardens. Daughters carried water, scrubbed mugs, and served guests. Sons mucked stables, fetched firewood, and ran errands. Servants, if affordable, bore the heaviest work, hauling, cleaning, enduring insults from impatient travelers. Their labor was relentless. Brewing ale alone was a full-time task, requiring careful timing, precise mixing, and constant tending. Bread had to be kneaded, loaves baked, barrels rolled. Floors were strewn with rushes to soak spills and filth, but rushes had to be replaced regularly. Fleas multiplied in corners, smoke blackened walls. Comfort for guests came at the expense of endless toil for the family. And yet, this toil was rarely acknowledged. Travelers saw only the bowl of stew, the mug of ale, the pallet of straw, not the aching backs and weary hands behind them. Hospitality, though essential, was invisible labor, reputation, and survival. For an inn, reputation was everything. A single robbery, a single outbreak of sickness could ruin trust. Word spread quickly along roads and through markets. Pilgrims warned one another, merchants repeated complaints, soldiers carried tales. To be known as dishonest or unsafe was to invite ruin. Thus, innkeepers cultivated reputation carefully. Some offered small kindnesses, a candle for a pilgrim, a safe corner for a widow, a trusted watch for merchants' goods. Others gave gifts to guilds or councils, buying goodwill. A painted sign, a stag, a swan, a star, helped travelers recognize familiar places. Trust was not easily won, but it was easily lost. The emotional toll. Finally, there was the burden of constant presence. The innkeeper's life was lived in public. His home was never private. Strangers slept on his floor, ate from his table, argued under his roof. There was little solitude, little rest. Even at night, when others slept, he listened for knocks, quarrels, or fire. This ceaseless exposure took its toll. Some innkeepers grew suspicious, their tempers short, their hearts guarded. Others leaned into the role, becoming storytellers, listeners, and mediators, finding satisfaction in the endless stream of human variety. Either way, the burden of hospitality shaped them deeply. So we see the inn not as a place of ease, but as a place of constant negotiation between generosity and profit, between safety and danger, between service and survival. Hospitality was not free. It demanded labor, coin, patience, and vigilance. And as you imagine the weary innkeeper sweeping floors at dawn, the wife stirring ale, the child carrying water, you may wonder, how did these burdens transform when crisis came? When war, famine, or plague swept through the land, and the inn was no longer just a haven for travelers, but a lifeline for entire communities? Inns at the crossroads of crisis. When times were calm, the medieval inn bore its ordinary burdens, feeding strangers, providing straw, collecting coin. But history seldom remained calm for long. War, famine, and plague swept through Europe like recurring storms, and in their wake, the humble inn found itself reshaped. It was no longer simply a place of rest for weary travelers. It became a refuge, a prison, sometimes a grave. To understand inns fully, you must place them in these moments of crisis, when the burden of hospitality bent under pressures far beyond the ordinary. War at the door. Imagine first the disruption of war. Armies on the march consumed everything in their path. Grain from fields, timber from barns, meat from herds. Inns, situated along roads, were among the first to feel the pressure. Soldiers demanded food and drink, often without payment. Some paid with clipped coins or false promises, others with threats of violence. For an innkeeper, refusal could mean ruin, but compliance drained resources needed for paying guests. The common room of the inn, usually filled with pilgrims and merchants, now bristled with armed men. Helmets clattered onto tables, swords leaned against walls, muddy boots stamped the rushes underfoot. Ale was poured in endless jugs, stew ladled until pots ran dry. The innkeeper's wife hurried between guests, her face pale, her hands trembling. Outside, horses filled the yard, their snorts and stamping echoing through the night. Townsfolk looked on with suspicion. To serve soldiers was to risk being labeled a collaborator. To refuse them was to risk destruction. The inn stood at the crossroad of survival, caught between loyalty to community and necessity of appeasing power. And yet, even in war, inns served vital roles. Messengers galloped between commanders, stopping at inns to rest or change horses. Councils met in private chambers above common rooms, negotiating truces or plotting defenses. Sometimes, an inn was the only neutral ground where rival lords dared meet, their retainers watching warily from opposite corners of the yard. Inns and famine. Famine brought a different crisis, quieter but no less devastating. When harvests failed and stores ran low, the inn struggled to provide even its meager offerings. Stew became thinner, bread smaller, ale weaker. Guests grumbled, accusing innkeepers of cheating, but in truth, there was little to offer. In such times, barter grew desperate. Pilgrims brought nothing but hunger. Merchants carried goods no one could eat. The innkeepers stretched meals with herbs, peas porridge, and whatever scraps could be found. Rats grew bold, scurrying across floors to nibble crumbs. Dogs fought over bones in the yard. For the poor, famine meant exclusion. Only those with coin or goods could secure a bed or bowl. Beggars clustered at the inn's door, hoping for scraps, their faces hollow, their eyes pleading. Some innkeepers offered charity, ladling broth into wooden cups. Others closed doors, fearing theft or contagion. Either choice carried cost, either in coin or in reputation. Plague at the threshold. Most terrible of all was plague. When disease swept across towns, the inn became both haven and hazard. Strangers arriving from distant roads carried sickness with them, invisible and unstoppable. To admit them was to risk infection. To refuse them was to abandon hospitality itself. The plague years transformed inns into sites of fear. Travelers were eyed with suspicion, their coughs and fevers whispered about. Straw pallets lay empty as guests fled or died. Dogs howled outside, the smell of sickness seeping through shuttered windows. Councils sometimes ordered inns closed entirely, hoping to halt contagion. For innkeepers, survival meant impossible choices. Some shut their doors, barricading themselves inside, their businesses collapsing. Others remained open, gambling with death, driven by desperation. Chronicles tell of inns where entire households perished, their doors nailed shut, the building left to rot. Yet even in plague, inns remained essential. Messengers carrying news of outbreaks needed shelter. Physicians on the road, carrying remedies or charms, needed a hearth. Pilgrims, driven by desperation to seek holy shrines, still knocked at doors. Hospitality did not vanish. It merely darkened, twisted into something fragile and fearful. Inns as community lifelines. In crisis, inns often became lifelines for their towns. When famine struck, councils sometimes commandeered inns as distribution points, using their hearths and yards to ration bread or grain. When war threatened, inns housed soldiers or officials, their common rooms filled not with laughter but with maps and orders. When plague raged, inns became infirmaries or shelters, their straw pallets lined with the sick. The inn's central location, its space for gathering, and its role as host to strangers made it both vulnerable and invaluable. Towns relied on them, even as innkeepers groaned under the weight of expectation. The innkeeper's burden in crisis. For the innkeeper, crisis magnified every burden. Supplies grew scarce, coin devalued, tempers frayed. Guests grew suspicious, accusing him of hoarding or overcharging. Authorities scrutinized his accounts, demanded taxes even when business collapsed. His family suffered, exposed to disease and violence more than most. And yet, some innkeepers thrived in crisis. Those who managed supplies carefully, who built trust, who adapted swiftly, gained reputations for reliability. Their inns became refuges, known for fairness or charity. Others fell into ruin, their names cursed by travelers who found only locked doors or empty bowls. The difference often lay not in wealth, but in judgment. When to open the door, when to close it, when to give freely, when to demand coin. These were decisions made daily, each carrying risks, each shaping reputation. Inns in memory. When the crises passed, when armies marched on, harvests returned, or plague retreated, the inns remained, scarred but enduring. Survivors remembered them vividly. A merchant recalled the inn where he found shelter from soldiers. A pilgrim told of the inn where he was turned away during plague. A widow spoke of the inn that gave her bread in famine. These stories lingered, passed along roads and markets, shaping reputation across years. Thus, inns became more than buildings. They became symbols of resilience or cruelty, of generosity or greed. In memory, they were judged not only by what they offered in comfort, but by how they responded in crisis. The medieval inn, humble though it was, stood at the crossroads of history. In times of peace, it offered shelter. In times of crisis, it became a stage where the virtues and failings of hospitality were laid bare. It bore burdens far greater than stew and straw. It bore the weight of human survival itself. And so, as you picture the inn at night, its door barred against plague, or its yard filled with soldiers' horses, or its hearth crowded with starving townsfolk, you may ask, what happened when the crisis ended, when peace returned, when famine lifted, when plague ebbed? Did the inn simply return to normal life, or were its rhythms forever altered by the memory of hardship? The legacy of the inn. The medieval inn was never meant to be extraordinary. It was a building of wood and stone, a hearth and a yard, a place of stew, ale, and straw. Yet, in its very ordinariness, it carried a quiet legacy. It shaped how people traveled, how communities functioned, and how memories of hospitality endured. To complete the story of the inn, we must look not only at its daily burdens and moments of crisis, but also at the meaning it left behind for those who lived in its shadow. The rhythm of return. One of the most powerful legacies of the inn was continuity. Travelers did not visit once and forget. Merchants followed routes year after year, and pilgrims walked the same roads as generations before them. Inns became landmarks, woven into the rhythm of travel. A merchant from Bruges, trudging toward Cologne, knew where he might find a bed after the 15th mile. A pilgrim from York, heading toward Canterbury, had heard tales of the inn near the bridge, where stew was thin but the hearth was kind. A soldier, marching with his company, remembered which inns watered horses fairly and which overcharged. The inn lived in memory not as an isolated stop, but as part of the road itself. Its reputation carried across borders and generations. Children who once ran errands in its yard returned as adults with coin in hand. Pilgrims told stories of the places where they were welcomed or rejected, shaping expectations for those who followed. The inn as social theater. The inn was also a stage where society performed itself. Rich and poor, stranger and local, soldier and pilgrim, all sat under the same roof, sharing stew from the same pot. Differences remained, but for a night they were softened by necessity. Merchants haggled in whispers over ale. Pilgrims prayed quietly before bed. Soldiers compared scars by the fire. Minstrels strummed lutes, earning coppers for songs that mingled with the crackle of flames. In such scenes, the inn became a mirror of the wider world, its tensions, its hierarchies, but also its fragile unity. The innkeeper, like a conductor, oversaw this performance. He decided who sat where, who was welcomed, who was turned away. His choices shaped the tone of the room, sometimes preventing conflict, sometimes provoking it. Through him, the inn became more than walls. It became a living microcosm of medieval life. The cultural echo of hospitality. Hospitality carried deep cultural meaning in medieval Europe. Rooted in Christian teachings, reinforced by ancient custom, the idea of sheltering strangers was seen as both duty and virtue. The inn embodied this principle, though in practical, imperfect ways. To refuse a pilgrim might bring shame. To welcome one brought honor. To cheat a guest invited curses. To offer fairness gained prayers. These echoes mattered, for reputation was the currency of the road. An inn's character was measured not only in coin but in stories, whispered along paths and retold in market squares. This cultural echo gave inns a symbolic weight beyond their size. They were remembered in chronicles, mentioned in travelers' tales, and immortalized in plays and poems. The Canterbury Tales begins at an inn, not by accident, but by recognition that such places gathered the diversity of human voices. The transformation of inns. By the later Middle Ages, inns grew in size and formality. Some towns built grand establishments, with painted signs, private chambers, and stables for dozens of horses. These were not merely shelters but institutions, tied to guilds, licensed by councils, and recognized by kings. At the same time, humbler inns persisted in villages, little more than farmhouses with an extra pallet. The spectrum was broad, but the essence remained, a place where strangers found temporary refuge. The rise of coaching inns in the early modern period, larger, busier, with organized routes, would transform hospitality further. But the medieval inn laid the foundation. Its practices of feeding, lodging, and regulating strangers became the blueprint for what followed. Memory in stone and story. Today, few medieval inns survive intact. Fire, time, and change erased most. Some were rebuilt, their medieval bones hidden beneath plaster or brick. Others linger as ruins, ivy climbing over half-collapsed walls. Yet their memory endures, in archives, in literature, and in the habits of hospitality that followed. When you walk down a narrow street in York or Bruges and see a timbered house leaning inward, you may be seeing the ghost of an inn. When you enter an English pub with a name like the Swan or the Stag, you step into a lineage reaching back to medieval signs that once guided weary travelers. The stew may be richer now, the beds cleaner, but the essence is the same. Welcome to those who wander. The quiet legacy of ordinary places. The legacy of the medieval inn lies not in grand battles or royal decrees, but in the quiet persistence of ordinary places. They sustained life in small ways, by offering stew to the hungry, ale to the thirsty, straw to the weary. They created spaces where human variety gathered, where stories mingled, where news traveled. For most people, the inn was not extraordinary, but that was its strength. It was steady, predictable, a light in the dark along uncertain roads. And in a world of chaos, war, famine, plague, that steadiness mattered more than grandeur. As you imagine the medieval inn one last time, picture it not in the noise of feast or the terror of crisis, but in its most ordinary moment. The fire burns low, guests doze on straw, the innkeeper snores in his chair, a dog curls near the door. Outside, the road stretches into darkness, carrying the footsteps of those who have passed and those who will come. The inn remains, a building of wood and stone, of stew and ale, of burdens and kindness. Its legacy is not carved in marble, but in memory, in the countless stories of travelers who found, for one night, a place to rest. And so the question lingers. When we think of history, do we honor only kings and castles, or do we also remember the quiet inns, the small, steady places, without which no journey could have been made?